Hey. By this point, this is probably pretty obvious, but we of Team Real New love talking about the philosophy behind the creation of art. And whether you just joined us in the last month or you've been on the channel for a while, you've heard me use the term plurality. In art, pluralism refers to an explosion of offshoots and substyles and spin-offs and tangents that come about as a natural byproduct of the infinite nature of human creativity. Like I said in the last episode, we are human, and so we are different, and so we create differently. Not only is pluralism an important part of the expressive and evolutionary process of art, it's essentially inevitable. And from movies to video games to our current topic, American jazz, everything that is one will eventually tend towards being many. Which on a grander scale is the natural order of the entire universe, but that's a different conversation. Now we can interpret the shift to plurality to both the natural creative tendency towards the new, doing something that hasn't been done before, and advances in resources allowing for more possibilities. You might remember me mentioning that Sir Duke's stranger compositions later in his career, they were nothing new for him. It's just that now he had the technology to fully capture his vision. And unsurprisingly, these technological advances had a profound impact on the rest of American music too. The revolution in music tech through the 20th century is an enormously broad topic, one big enough to fill a few videos of its own and well beyond the scope of this miniseries. But I'll mention the two that are most pertinent to our conversation, even though many of y'all probably already know them. The first is the general way that music was disseminated, both through radio and records. Throughout the 20th century, music tech had been gradually advancing to the point at which, via these means, anyone could hear anything from anywhere in the world. In the late 60s, this had the effect of introducing many musicians to music well outside of their cultural bounds that they wouldn't have heard otherwise, leading to, for the first time in music history, at least on this scale, intermixing of musical styles that wasn't based on geographical proximity. And this wasn't unique to fusion either. Coltrane, for example, had famously experimented with world music. The second was multi-track recording, another increasingly standard aspect of the industry that the Beatles were credited with popularizing. Now for those who don't know, multi-track recording meant that no longer was released music limited solely to what a band could physically achieve on stage. Anyone, even a single person, could create an entire band by themselves, provided they had the technical know-how, and some did. And looking at both of these advances together, we take it for granted today, but it really cannot be overstated just how seismic a shift this was in the music creation process. Not only did musicians now have a broader perspective on the world at large, but thanks to these new tools, their only limit now was their imagination. With or without these factors, pluralism would have been inevitable. But with them, boy did the scene pluralize. And even with all this context and the socio-political, economic, and technological factors we've discussed, what we've talked about thus far is still, in many ways, a simplification of the full story of the birth of fusion. We'd need separate videos on the rock and funk lineages that lead to the music. We'd need to talk about how bookers and producers put jazz and rock acts on the same shows, in an effort to bring jazz's legitimacy and rock and funk's popularity into concert with one another. But again, these videos have to have a scope, which for us means that we're approaching this in-between hybrid in as focused a manner as possible, specifically from the lens of jazz. Which is appropriate considering that fusion was a name being assigned to the new jazz being made specifically. Regardless, the moment of fusion's birth was a bittersweet moment for many. Many writers hailed it as the next natural and necessary step in the continued prosperity of jazz. Some musicians rejected it as $sign music, saying that its monetary incentives invalidated it of all artistic worth. Still others threw themselves fully into the new music, creating elaborate new groups outfitted with all manner of electronic and acoustic instruments, the most prominent of which were headed up, not coincidentally, by Miles Davis alumni. But as is the theme of this entire series, I'm here to try and drop at least one name you've never heard of too. So buckle up, y'all. Let's get pluralistic.
Games and movies are our sweet reveries. We present everybody's gone to bed and sleep and we're up all night instead. Games and movies are our sweet reveries. We present 3 a.m. Soliloquy.
Alright, we did it. We'll start where we ended last time. Miles Davis. In many ways, Davis's work in the late 60s was the most powerful link between the great black music we discussed in the first few episodes and this new fusion, particularly stuff like Fille de Kilimanjaro. In a Silent Way, which depending on who you ask is the true start of fusion, and of course, Bitches Brew. It was on some of these early fusion records that a fateful reunion occurred, between a name I'm sure most of you know, Wayne Shorter, and a name that maybe some of you don't, Joe Zawinul. The former having become one of the biggest names in bop, and the latter having become one of the biggest names in soul jazz. As part of the second great quintet, Shorter was no stranger to blending traditional jazz with more ethnic and free elements. And together with Czech bassist Miroslav Vitoš, they founded one of the earliest of the Miles Davis fusion bands, Weather Report. Vitoš had previously played with future fusion heavyweights like Chick Corea, Herby Hancock, Jack DeJohnette, and John McLaughlin, so they already had all the same mutual acquaintances. And joining them was drummer Alphonse Mouzon, but only for a year before he went into a solo career, and eventually wound up with another prominent fusion group who we'll talk about later. And all of this is without even getting into Jaco Pastorius, undoubtedly one of the most well-known and celebrated jazz bassists of all time, and was a huge part of legitimizing electric bass in a jazz context, alongside guys like Stanley Clarke, of course. Its music took a lot of inspiration from the second great quintet, experimenting with many of the same floating textures and de-emphasizing the one-at-a-time solo structure, the same stuff that had made the Miles Davis group a successful balancing act between the avant-garde and bop. Zawinul himself, who was the creative director for many years, was always on the cutting edge of synthesizer technology, which he used to give the group a unique sound, literally a sound only he could make. Nevertheless, and kind of ironically, they faced criticism for being too over-processed, too safe. It's worth mentioning that, owing both to more elaborate instrumentation inspired by the technological advances we talked about earlier, and a deeper pool of talent since jazz and rock had now kind of had a generation to get some overlap in their adherence, to list all the personnel that occupied each of these groups throughout their lifespans would be ridiculous. Not to mention the various ways that many of these musicians interacted with both jazz and the music world on the whole. Because, and I can attest to this personally, very, very few musicians who make a living off of music primarily or solely are going to do so by playing just one genre. Take Omar Hakim, for example, who's still alive and well, by the way. He joined up with Weather Report in the 80s, 12 years after their founding. But he also played with David Bowie, Madonna, Celine Dion, Mariah Carey. I mean, you name it in the popular music sphere, this guy's done it. But I'd imagine a lot of you probably have never heard of this man. Because this is the reality of being in the creative arts for most people. You do your job, you do it really well, and you will work. But pop music is all about big names and big faces. Not that that's very different between jazz and pop. Example, and some of you super nerds watching this video might be able to do this, but can you guys, off the top of your heads, name the full personnel listing of the most consistent incarnation of Duke's Orchestra in the 30s? Now, this isn't to say that these people shouldn't be remembered and acknowledged. In fact, that's part of why we're here now, right? But it is to say that we talk about people who have changed things, for, subjectively and proverbially, better or worse. Now let's talk about another Miles Davis alum, and debatably my single biggest inspiration to pursue this music, and in turn, music in general, Armando Anthony Chick Corea. In 1972, he would form the extremely popular Return to Forever. While it was neither his first band nor his last, Return to Forever was definitely Chick's best known act, or at least best remembered, featuring the flautist Joe Farrell and the aforementioned Stanley Clarke, as well as, prominently, the Brazilian-born couple Flora Purim and Ayrton Moreira. They had come to America 5 years prior, and in the interim had toured with Stan Getz and Gil Evans. Now, if y'all know about Getz, you know he was one of the primary exponents of the earliest forms of Latin jazz. And this infusion of Brazilian music coupled with Chick's already prodigious writing and playing abilities would see the band put out some of the lightest and most pleasing music of the decade. Now, the album that everybody points to is Light as a Feather, and rightfully so, since it's often considered one of the signature albums of fusion, and one of very few fusion albums that writers generally agree stood the test of time. One trend that we'll tend to see in critical reevaluations of fusion is that a lot of it was trend-chasing music, and to be fair, some of the artists who made this music retrospectively felt that they were chasing trends when making some of it. But again, the two are not mutually exclusive. If you wrote a single record to try and make the cover of Downbeat and pay your bills, does that automatically mean none of the other stuff you made has any artistic merit? I think most reasonable people would say no. But anyway, as his career progressed, Chick would start to incorporate pretty much every genre under the sun, but most prominently would start to bring in Romantic era language and traditional flamenco. Personally, you want a cool chick listening experience? My Spanish Heart. I could point towards like maybe 10 pieces of media in total that made me want to do what I'm doing now, and that's one of them. If you're looking for something a little more out there, Mad Hatter. Of course, Chick's music in the 70s is often mentioned in conjunction with his friend and fellow pianist, Miles Davis alum, and genre-defying composer, Herby Hancock. The great Herby Hancock. The great Herby Hancock, okay? Just my opinion. I've been trying not to put a lot of my opinions on these artists in here, but I can't help it. Herbie's so good. It's worth mentioning that Herby left the Miles group before the Silent Way and Bitches Brew recordings, but he would still create a fusion group of his own. One I'm sure most of you all are very familiar with. The Headhunters, rather than the pseudo-romantic Latin-inspired stylings of Return to Forever, were instead, as I briefly discussed in the last video, far more rooted in the recognizably black American idioms of funk and the blues. And their self-titled album is one situated comfortably at the intersection of many aspects of not just black American music, but African music as well. More specifically, the Babenzele people of Central African Republic, whose music was retrieved from field recordings gathered by two enterprising ethnomusicologists, Simha Arom and Genevieve Terrell. Not to mention that Hancock was verifiably attracted to the sounds and attitudes of funk music. He admired its ability to connect directly to hip and politically aware black youth. And by framing this Babenzele music against an electronic American soundscape, he directly connected the music of black American youth to the Afrofuturist aesthetic that we discussed as having been so prominent in music of the 60s. And in doing so, he masterfully painted this really holistic portrait of the Pan-Africanist sentiment that black folks have been grappling with through the late 20th century, as well as cutting an all-time classic record that showed what fusion could really be in the right hands. Now, Headhunters is another record that gets a pass in most traditional jazz circles, perhaps because it was so obviously rooted in black popular music. To bring up Stephen Pond one more time, in his book about the album, he rules out money or fame as motives for the record, as Hancock already had plenty of both. He cites it as a genuine example of true creative output, a much-needed validation for the possibilities of fusion. And again, fusion was not always this commercially motivated endeavor. Now, there were a lot of people both at the time and in retrospect that dismiss it as such, but look at the birth dates: 1941, 1940, 1932, 1933. Most of these guys were not selling out, they were doing what every jazz musician before them had done, taking the idioms of this thing called jazz and combining it with the popular music of their time. Let's step back and look at things for what they are for a second. This was a generation of people who grew up listening to bebop, hard bop, soul, funk, rock and roll. Like, of course they'd be influenced by more than just pure jazz. And it doesn't take a musicologist to accurately assess that plurality begets further plurality. Now there's a topic for our next episodes, but what it all comes down to, fusion as a denotative label of hybrid music of the 70s was largely an artificially applied one done for the purposes of marketing. Now, where have I heard that before? That sounds familiar. Now, just to reinforce that point, I'm going to take us back about 10 years to 1961. And we're going to see just how deep the roots of fusion were running long before anyone thought to call it that. So let's talk about Chico Hamilton. Now, I'm sure that that's a name many of you have only heard in passing, but you have heard it. And there's a reason for that too. Let's look at his resume real quick. Billie Holiday, Sammy Davis Jr., Basie, Duke, Mingus, Dexter Gordon. I mean, some of these people he was playing with while he was still in high school. His resume is the who's who of mid-century jazz. Naturally, it didn't take long for him to start leading a band of his own. And much like Miles himself, it's the second incarnation of his group that we're concerned with for this video. If you haven't heard it, check out the album Man from Two Worlds, released in 1963, and see if you can slap a denotative label on it. It's equal parts jazz, sort of free, country and rock elements, almost chamber music-like in many ways. While more rooted in the soul and West Coast sound that was popular at the time, the group was undeniably trying to push the bounds of the idiom they were working in. And stylistically bridging it all was a young Hungarian guitarist named Gabor Szabó. He brought the sounds of his folk music into the jazz context, a herald for just how much fusion was going to pull from other cultures. Now, in 1966, Szabó was replaced by the guitarist Larry Coryell, both of whom are often regarded as extremely important forebears to fusion music. Coryell was actually Miles' first choice of guitarist for his inaugural fusion recordings, but he declined and instead suggested his friend, future guitarist fusion heavyweight John McLaughlin. also still with us today, like Herby. McLaughlin is an English guitarist whose story, in many ways, is a perfect encapsulation of the history of fusion. He was born in Yorkshire. He grew up on a combination of classical music and blues greats like Lead Belly and Muddy Waters. He'd played free music in Germany, and all of this was before his fateful excursion to New York in 1969, where he would record with Miles, and meet several of the prominent fusion players in the process. Now, McLaughlin's story was intertwined with another Miles Davis alum and a creative powerhouse in his own right, Tony Williams. Like Herby, he actually left the Miles Davis group prior to these fusion recordings, and instead formed a group in 1969 called Lifetime, which astute viewers will note was a year prior to Weather Report, making this the earliest Miles Davis alum fusion band. A lot of people will tell you it's Weather Report, but that's not entirely accurate. Now, following the sessions with Miles, McLaughlin actually turned down his offer to continue with his band, doing so in favor of Lifetime, feeling that he would have more of a chance with Tony Williams to play his original stuff than he would with Miles. Joining the two of them was the organist Larry Young. Now, this was a guy who came from the school of Jimmy Smith, which, if y'all know anything about soul jazz, you know that Jimmy Smith is the pinnacle of excellence on that instrument. Williams himself would later describe Larry as the genius of that band, an insistence that was indicative of his own intentions to use his group to explore the relationship between popular and art music. Another thing we've talked about on this channel before, although in the context of video games. So in this way, we can trace a lineage from Williams back to McLaughlin, back to Corea, back to Chico Hamilton, back to the swing greats, and all within the span of no more than 2 decades. Again, proving that all these styles aren't nearly as stratified as we make them out to be, a stratification many critics seemed to deliberately worsen. It's funny how many critics acted like artists negotiating the line between necessary commerce and artistic integrity was a new thing when that's all artists have ever done, and continue to have to do, but again, that's a topic for another discussion. Williams was also acutely aware of the relationship between genre signifiers and racial politics, which was the big thing we talked about last video. And his band, like much of fusion, was an effort to disrupt and challenge, if not altogether destroy, those notions. Now, we've talked about many links between free music and fusion. Their inherent countercultural tendencies to challenge norms and assumptions about music, their response to racial politics in America, their paralleling of the popular circumstance of the time. But one way we haven't discussed in depth is how much of what went on was rooted in the philosophical and spiritual perspectives of the people making the art. Chick's worldview was famously drastically changed by his introduction to Scientology. Now keep in mind, we're not here to evaluate the merits of different religious beliefs, but it is a fact that this perspective change compelled Chick to make much of the space traveler, universally transient kind of music that he was known for. And in that same tract, after coming to America, McLaughlin took up yoga, which eventually led to him meeting the guru Sri Chinmoy through his friend Coriel's manager. McLaughlin recounts this of his experience with Chinmoy. If you are a musician and work towards enlightenment, your music will automatically be a part of it. Of course, this was a great answer, and I subsequently went to see him several times, and after a few weeks, I became a disciple. The story goes that the drummer Billy Cobham was the first of McLaughlin's new group, the two of them having met during a Miles engagement. He met Jan Hammer and Jerry Goodman through mutual acquaintances, and he'd known Rick Laird since way back. According to McLaughlin, it was actually Chinmoy who gave him the name for his new group, and thus was born the Mahavishnu Orchestra. For a lot of people, this was a truly exciting group. They combined instrumentation and music from jazz, rock, European concert elements, and even world music. It was spiritual, it was meditative, and above all, it was experimental, which was something that a lot of critics had felt was lacking from much of fusion music. So they really kind of lived up to their name. Now, Corea wasn't just the guy who got McLaughlin the job of a lifetime, he also started his own fusion group. Actually, and this isn't widely known, 2 of them. First in the early 70s came Foreplay. This was a group he co-founded with his longtime friend and keyboardist Mike Mandel, and he cut a number of records showcasing the merging of his old influence, Wes Montgomery, with his new one, Jimi Hendrix. In spite of being one of the groups to lead the charge, their music was some of the first to actually rein in the freer stylings of groups like Lifetime and the Miles Davis Band, in favor of something more recognizably rooted in rock and roll, blues, and funk, yielding up a sound that was actually more reminiscent of Headhunters than anything else. Seriously, check out their 1972 record, Offering, which is credited to just Coriel, which is why the band Foreplay isn't all that widely known, and tell me that these guys weren't way ahead of their time. tell me that they weren't foreplay for the fusion that was going to come through the rest of the decade. Had a couple double entendres there. It's no wonder that Al Di Meola himself would call Coryell the godfather of fusion, although whether you agree with that assessment is subjective. And all of this was before he founded the band he's actually known for, 11th House, in 1973. And this is an appropriate place for us to end this time, because this was music that was actually more indicative of what fusion on the whole was going to look like going forward. Take a listen to the aptly named Introducing the 11th House, and we can hear a clear evolution of Coryell's fusion sensibilities, now accompanied by things like sweeping unison lines, smooth gliding synths, airy horn arrangements, steady Latin and rock-infused grooves, and of course, blazing virtuosity. All of which were things that were becoming increasingly standard, as the disparate elements of the music called fusion began to kind of take an identifiable shape. So as we can see here, fusion is less of a straight line or circle, and more of a tapestry of interconnected musicians from all these different regions and substyles of the music, all drawing from one another to create a style that was tangentially unified, but extremely diverse. But like I said, there's a ton of fusion. There's so much of it that we weren't even able to get through all of the crucial people in this one episode. So tune in next time and we'll talk about people like Joni Mitchell and Freddie Hubbard, and some of the many other offshoots that fall under the umbrella of this glorious music, as well as how and why many of these powerhouse bands eventually dissolved. Stay tuned, and as always, thank you all so much